In our first lecture series, we discussed the role of the nervous system in muscle contractions. We know generally that for muscles to contract, it all begins with the nervous system. The CNS, the central nervous system, propagates signals via action potentials towards the muscle via motor neurons, and through a process called EC coupling, as we discussed, the muscle contracts and produces force. Now, although the activation of the muscle via the nervous system is obviously a critical part of muscle contractions, it is not the only factor that is required for muscle contractions. There is another proponent of muscle contractions in addition to activation by the nervous system. And this other proponent of muscle contractions is fuel and energy. In other words, not only do muscles, more specifically muscle fibers, require electrical stimuli from the nervous system to contract, it also requires energy. So first, what is energy? Energy is the quantitative property that must be transferred to an object in order to perform work on the object or to heat the object. Let's put this into simpler terms. Energy is the ability to do work. Energy is how things change and how things move. So to put this into the context of muscle contractions, in order for muscles to do work, like contract and produce muscular force, it requires energy. Let's put it into a very specific context. In order for muscles to do work like contract and produce force, the myofilaments within the muscle fibers must undergo crossbridge cycling, as we discussed in the first lecture series. And this process requires energy. Okay, so now that we have a general understanding of the importance of energy for muscles to function, or in other words, contract, we can now understand that when the energy is depleted or unavailable, then muscle contractions and thus muscular force production and thus performance would be negatively affected. We should also understand when our muscles do more work, like when we go from walking to running to sprinting, or when you squat 100 to 200 to 300 pounds, there is increasing energy demand. This is basic information to most of us, since most of us generally know that when we exercise harder, we expend more energy. So the next fundamental question is, well, where does this energy come from? Let's use an example. Where do you think the energy for a car engine to do work comes from? What do we need to constantly provide the car for the engine to run? You guessed it, it's fuel. Fuel is a source of energy. Energy is quote-unquote trapped within the chemical bonds of fuel molecules. And to harness that energy so that the engine can run, the fuel needs to undergo chemical reactions to break up the fuel molecule bonds to release that energy from those bonds. We often just call this process quote-unquote burning fuel. Now here's an important fact to remember. According to the laws of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created nor destroyed, meaning it can only be released and transferred from one object to another. So when fuel is burned, the energy, quote-unquote, trapped in the fuel molecules are released. Energy is not created. It's just released from the fuel molecules. Now, some of that energy is released and lost in the form of heat energy, and this is why your car heats up when it runs. And a good portion of the energy released from the fuel molecules is used to do work on the engine, thereby allowing the engine to run. Now let's take this example and apply it to muscle contractions and exercise. In order for muscles to do work and produce force to move the body, the muscle fibers require energy to contract. Where does the energy come from? Just like the car, it comes from fuel molecules. Now what is different from the car is that the muscle, or the human body in general, uses multiple types of fuel, generally referred to as macronutrients, or just nutrients in general. We will go over those in a moment. So in order for the muscle fibers to harness the energy within these fuel molecules, just like the car, the fuel molecules need to be quote-unquote burned. They need to undergo special chemical, in this case biochemical reactions, to break up those fuel molecule bonds, to release the energy within those bonds. Now, just like the car example, some of that energy that is released from the fuel molecules is in the form of heat energy. And this is why you heat up when you contract muscles, like when you exercise. And of course, we have an awesome, well-coordinated system called sweating to help remove that heat from the inside of our body so we can maintain our core body temperature so we don't overheat. Now, what about the rest of the energy that is released from those fuel molecules? In the car, the rest of the energy is used to run the engine. In the same way, the rest of the energy that is not lost as heat is used to quote unquote run the muscle. It is used to allow the muscle fibers to do work, to contract. Now, here's an important concept. In biology, there is a difference in that energy is not transferred directly from the fuel to the muscle fibers, meaning it is not directly transferred from the fuel to the contractile components of the muscle fibers. Your cells use an intermediate, temporary, quote unquote, fuel molecule that holds the energy for a very brief period of time. What do you think this intermediate, temporary fuel molecule is called? Some of you may have guessed adenosine triphosphate, which is commonly known as ATP. So fuel molecules are broken up, energy is released and held temporarily in the bonds of ATP, and then ATP is broken up, and again, the energy is released to allow muscle fibers to do work, to contract. This is why ATP is considered the cell's energy currency. So when fuel is burned and energy is released, ATP is formed. ATP is there to hold that energy for a temporary period of time, to subsequently release it to something else like a muscle fiber or the components of the muscle fiber so that work can be performed. Okay, so now that we got down some of the basics, we should know that this entire process from fuel to ATP/energy to work is referred to as bioenergetics. So skeletal muscle bioenergetics is the process by which energy is transferred from fuel to drive muscle contractions. So as you can see, bioenergetics is an important aspect of exercise and exercise performance. We will define bioenergetics further in a couple slides, but first I want to present a figure to provide an overview of muscle bioenergetics. So here we have what we call a reverse causal model. So what we're basically doing is a cause and effect process, but in reverse. So we have the endpoint. The endpoint is exercise. We want to perform exercise movements just like the back squat like we see in this animation. So let's ask some basic questions. In order for us to exercise and move, what needs to happen? Well, we know generally that muscle contractions need to happen. In order for us to move our body, we need specific muscles to contract to produce enough forces to generate joint actions. Here we have an example of a joint action called elbow flexion. And in order to produce this elbow flexion, we need the biceps to contract and apply force on the bones of our limbs to move our limbs across the joint. So let's dissect this even further. In order to contract our muscles, what needs to occur in our muscles? Well, as we learned in the first lecture series, muscles contract because inside muscle fibers, we have the myofilaments undergoing the sliding filament process. As you can see, the thick and thin filament are sliding across one another. Remember, the muscles shorten and lengthen during contractions because the myofilaments within each of the fibers slide past one another. So let's dissect this even more. In order for the thick and thin filament to slide past one another to produce a muscle contraction to perform exercise, what needs to occur? We know from our first lecture series that the thick and thin myofilaments need to physically interact with one another through a process called Crossbridge cycling. The myosin head attaches to the actin of the thin filament and slides it across. Now, we have discussed the process up to this point in lecture series 1. If you remember the first lecture series, we discussed the requirements for cross-bridge cycling. We discussed how in order for the myosin head to connect to the actin to do work on the thin filament, like sliding it across, it requires energy. And we discussed briefly that the energy comes from this little molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And the process by which the energy is released from ATP, we said, was referred to as ATP hydrolysis, which is essentially breaking up the ATP molecule to release the energy inside it. In other words, ATP is hydrolyzed. Now, more on this process later. But for now, just know that the energy to drive this cross-bridge cycling process comes from ATP, which we said was an intermediate temporary fuel molecule that holds energy for a brief period of time. Therefore, in order for cross-bridge cycling to occur, there needs to be ATP available. So just to recap thus far, to perform exercise, we need muscle contractions. To contract muscles, the myofilaments need to slide across one another per the sliding filament theory. For the myofilaments to slide across one another, you need cross-bridge cycling. For cross-bridge cycling to occur, you need energy. The energy is derived from ATP and the breakup of ATP, which again we said was called ATP hydrolysis. And just as a reminder, ATP is often referred to as the cell's energy currency. It holds the energy temporarily after it is released from the breakdown of fuel molecules. So here now we see ATP, and we know that ATP is the immediate source of energy for cross-bridge cycling. I also alluded to the fact that ATP is an intermediate fuel molecule and that it holds energy for a very brief time, meaning once it is available, it will be hydrolyzed or broken apart, as you see here. It doesn't just hang around, nor is it stored in the cell in high amounts. When we exercise, our muscle cells require a constant availability of energy, which means it needs a constant availability of ATP. Since ATP is not stored, ATP must be constantly generated to meet the energy demand of the muscle cells during exercise. Now, just as a side note, keep in mind ATP is the energy currency for all cells in the body for whatever cellular function is pertinent to that cell. But we're just talking about it in the context of muscle fibers or muscle cells. So where does this ATP come from? It comes from the transfer of energy from fuel molecules, as I introduced in the first slide. And as we said in the introduction, this process is called bioenergetics. So we have bioenergetic systems that serve to break down fuel molecules, to release the energy from the fuel molecules, to hold it temporarily in ATP. And through that entire process, you form ATP. So essentially, bioenergetics is the process of generating ATP. Again, energy released from fuel and temporarily held in ATP, which will then subsequently be hydrolyzed. Now, bioenergetic systems can be generally categorized into two systems. We have the anaerobic system and aerobic system, also known as anaerobic metabolism and aerobic metabolism. Now, most of you, if I asked you what differentiates these two systems, you would say oxygen, and that is correct. The aerobic system breaks down fuel molecules to release its energy to form ATP, which again holds that energy temporarily, and it does this with the help of oxygen. It requires oxygen. And this is the whole reason why we need oxygen to live. Aerobic ATP production is not just relevant to muscle, it is important for all cells in the body, or at least most cells in the body. So anaerobic metabolism, or anaerobic ATP production, involves the breakdown of fuel molecules, the release of energy from said fuel molecules, and the formation of ATP, which again temporarily holds that energy. It does this without the need of oxygen. Okay, so anaerobic metabolism does not require the presence of oxygen. It can produce ATP from specific fuel molecules without oxygen. This is unlike aerobic metabolism. Now, in this lecture series, we'll spend a lot of time breaking down all the anaerobic and aerobic bioenergetic systems, or pathways in other words, and discuss how each system breaks down fuel to form ATP. So the next question is, what are the fuel sources? What is being metabolized? What type of molecules hold energy, and what type of molecules are going to be broken apart to release that energy through anaerobic or aerobic metabolism? As I said earlier, our body's fuel sources are referred to as macronutrients. These comprise of carbohydrate, fat, and protein molecules, with the first two, carbohydrates and fat, being the more utilized fuel sources. Now, these molecules in their chemical bonds hold energy that can be released. And like I said, through aerobic or anaerobic systems, the chemical bonds of these fuel molecules are broken up and energy is released. Some of this energy is gone in the form of heat, as I said before, and some of the energy is transferred and held inside the bonds of ATP. And as I said, this process results in the formation of ATP. Now, just to recap, the ATP is then broken up through hydrolysis, more specifically ATP hydrolysis, and in the context of muscle fiber contraction, this occurs on the myosin head, releasing the energy to the myosin head so that it can produce a crossbridge with the thin filament, which causes the sliding filament process, which causes muscle contractions, which allow for movement or exercise. Okay, so let's dissect this even further. Where do these fuel molecules come from? Now, we have two sources for fuel. First, we have fuel stored in various cells in the body within different organs. Fuel stored within the body is described as endogenous. Endogenous, endogenous. Endo meaning inside. So there are fat, carbohydrate, and protein stores within various cells in the body of various tissues or organs in the body. The major areas of fuel storage include the liver, adipose, and skeletal muscle. Now later we will discuss in what forms these fuel molecules are stored as in these different areas. But generally, the liver not only stores fuel, but it also distributes fuel to other parts of the body. Adipose is mainly meant for fuel storage. It's commonly referred to as your body's fuel reserve tank. And the fuel is largely in the form of fat molecules, large fat molecules. And this is why most people refer to adipose simply as fat. And muscle stores fuel in the form of all three, although protein is not favored as a fuel source. It is mostly carbohydrates and fat that muscle utilizes as fuel. Now, the next question is, where do these endogenous fuel stores come from? Meaning, after they are used, how are they replenished? I think most of you know it's by eating food that contains these fuels. In food, you have fat, carbs, and protein molecules that you can consume. The digestive system will break down the fat, carb, and protein molecules from food into smaller molecules. Large fat molecules are broken down into fatty acids, large carb molecules are broken down into glucose, and proteins are broken down into amino acids, its building blocks. Now, as it passes through the intestinal tract, these smaller molecules can be absorbed into blood circulation. These fuel molecules can then be stored somewhere in the body, such as in adipose, the liver, or muscle. So the fuel that is provided through food is described as exogenous, exogenous, exo referring to outside the body. So we have exogenous and endogenous fuel sources. The exogenous fuel molecules replenish endogenous fuel stores, and these endogenous fuels are then utilized by cells like muscle cells for its energy, again, through anaerobic or aerobic metabolism, your bioenergetic systems. So in summary, when one of these steps don't work properly or is interrupted in some way, every step that comes after that step would be negatively affected. For example, if there's not enough fuel, like say you exercise hard every single day, but you don't replenish your endogenous fuel stores by eating, ATP production would be inhibited, which would inhibit crossbridge cycling, which would inhibit sliding filament processes, which would inhibit muscle contractions, which would ultimately inhibit exercise performance. And this is why nutrition is so important for optimizing performance. So before you move forward in this lecture series, you must be able to understand this overview, since this will allow you to visualize the bioenergetics during exercise. Now, everything on the left side of this red border, we've already covered in the first lecture series. In this lecture series, we will discuss the right side of this border. First, we will discuss how energy is released from ATP to power processes like crossbridge cycling. In other words, we will discuss ATP hydrolysis so you can visualize what is happening on this myosin head when energy is transferred from ATP to the myosin head. Then we will discuss how ATP is formed by going over the bioenergetic systems that our muscle cells utilize, the anaerobic and aerobic bioenergetic systems. All right, so just to make sure we are all on the same page with regards to terminology, here are a couple of key definitions for your reference. So to reiterate, bioenergetics, sometimes referred to as energy metabolism, are the metabolic processes which include biochemical reactions that release energy from fuel and temporarily storing the energy in ATP, also known as energy currency. Remember, energy is never created or destroyed, only released and transferred. Now, a specific area of the study of bioenergetics is exercise bioenergetics, which is the response in these bioenergetic systems to a situation in which there is an increase in ATP/energy demand in active tissue/cells, especially skeletal muscle, since it is the major expender of energy during exercise. Now remember, energy is necessary to power the process of muscle contraction. So when you exercise, there will be an increase in energy and therefore ATP demand. Now, as we said in the previous slide, when ATP demand goes up, the bioenergetic systems respond by providing that ATP. Now, more specifically, however, when muscle activity/contractions increase, like during exercise, the rate of ATP demand increases, meaning the muscle cells need energy and thus ATP at a faster rate. Remember, rate is a certain quantity of something in relation to a unit of another thing, such as time. So for example, ATP per second. So in response to this increased rate of ATP demand, there is an increase in the rate of ATP production. And we will discuss later that certain bioenergetic systems and certain fuel sources are favored depending on the rate of ATP demand, meaning some bioenergetic systems produce ATP at a slow rate and some at a fast rate. Also, some fuel sources provide energy and thus ATP at a slow rate, and some fuel sources at a fast rate. So more on this later. Now the takeaway here is this right here. The level of muscle activity/contractions determines the rate of ATP demand, which in turn determines the rate of ATP production. So this will determine how active those bioenergetic systems are. So as we reviewed earlier, muscle fiber contractions are powered by the energy provided by ATP through the process of ATP hydrolysis, which is the process of splitting apart the ATP. Remember, ATP holds energy previously released from a fuel source for a brief period of time before it is hydrolyzed or broken down. When ATP is hydrolyzed, the energy is released and the energy is used to do work, like on the myosin filament to drive crossbridge cycling and muscle contractions. So let's talk about ATP, its chemical structure, and where this energy is stored. ATP has three components. It has an adenine backbone, which is a nitrogenous base. It has a ribose sugar and 3 phosphates, as you see right here. And as you can also see, they are bonded together. And these bonds are called phosphoanhydride bonds. PHOSPHOANHYDRIDE. Phosphoanhydride bonds. They are also referred to as simply phosphate bonds. These are phosphate to phosphate bonds. Now, this is where the term adenosine triphosphate comes from. Adenosine, which is adenine plus ribose, and 3-phosphate. Now, within these phosphate bonds, we have quote unquote trapped energy. Now, energy is not literally trapped within these bonds, but I just want you to visualize it as such, as trapped energy. So more technically speaking, high amounts of energy is required to maintain these bonds. And thus you can view these bonds as trapping energy. And remember, this energy to form this bond and thus form ATP comes from its release from a fuel molecule. Remember, energy can only be transferred, in this case, from a fuel molecule to here to form these phosphoanhydride or phosphate bonds. And in so doing, you form ATP. Now, without thinking too hard, how do you think the energy can be released from ATP? You can, quote unquote, free the energy by breaking up these phosphate bonds. And this process is again called ATP hydrolysis. And in the context of muscle contractions, this occurs again on the myosin head. Now, just as a side note, when we talk about energy in this lecture, we are not talking about the generic way people use the term energy, like things to energize your body. This is not what we're talking about. So we're not using the term energy like ads for example, 5-hour energy are using the term energy. So again, the energy that cells need to do work or simply function like muscle cells come from ATP, more specifically from the splitting of these phosphate bonds. So let's take a closer look at this process of splitting the phosphate bond to release the energy. Again, this process is referred to as ATP hydrolysis. So just as a side note, whenever you see a term end in lysis, it is a reaction that breaks apart a molecule. So ATP hydrolysis is the breaking apart of ATP. Hydro is referring to water. So we know that water is somehow involved in the lysis or breakdown of ATP. Now up here, we will have a more visual representation of ATP hydrolysis, and below is a more formulated depiction. So first we have ATP. We saw this in the previous slide. And as we said earlier, these phosphate bonds have trapped energy, quote unquote. This energy came from a fuel source and is being used to hold these bonds together. Now let's put this into the context of muscle contraction. ATP attaches to the myosin head, and in order for the myosin to do work on the thin filament, it requires energy, and ATP is going to provide it. So as we said, the energy in ATP is released by splitting up these bonds. In this case, this last bond right here. Now to split this bond, we need two things. First, we need a water molecule, H2O. Then we need a catalyst. And as most of us know, in biochemical reactions, a catalyst is usually in the form of an enzyme, which is a specialized protein that catalyzes biochemical reactions. So the enzyme that catalyzes ATP hydrolysis is ATPase. Any term ending in ASE in biochemistry is an enzyme molecule. So ATPase will catalyze this reaction of ATP hydrolysis where this bond is split open. And as a result of this reaction, the last phosphate is broken off because again, the bond, the phosphate bond between this phosphate and this phosphate has been broken. And in so doing, the energy that was trapped within this bond is now released. And this energy can then be used to power cross-bridge cycling and thus muscle contractions. Now, since the phosphate bond here was split up, you are left with ADP, as you see depicted here. Adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphates. And the free phosphate that broke off, as you see here, is referred to as an inorganic phosphate. Now, as you see here, we have a positively charged hydrogen ion, and this is simply referred to as a proton. This came off of the water molecule. So one of the hydrogens was released, and now it is a free hydrogen ion, a positively charged hydrogen ion, or again, a proton. Now, this proton here plays a major role in the fatigue you feel during exercise, especially heavy or high intensity exercise. And we will introduce this topic in this lecture series, meaning we will introduce the science of muscle fatigue during exercise. But this is a major topic in my exercise bioenergetics and metabolism course, KIN3030. So we will talk about muscle fatigue in much more detail in that class. Okay, so in summary, ATP hydrolysis is the splitting of the phosphate bonds of ATP, releasing energy. Now, if only one bond was broken or hydrolyzed, then you are left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with only 2 phosphates. And to resynthesize this back to ATP, you need energy from a fuel molecule to be transferred over to form a new phosphate bond on ADP and thus forming ATP. So bioenergetics is basically taking this guy right here and just forming a new bond, making it ATP. And in order for this to happen, energy needs to be released from the fuel molecule to create this bond right here. And this is exactly what bioenergetic systems do. They form ATP. They resynthesize ATP by transferring energy over to form these phosphate bonds. So let's now talk about how fuel is broken down to release its energy to form ATP, especially during exercise when the rate of ATP demand increases. So to lead us into this discussion on the ATP producing bioenergetic systems, I have 3 fundamental questions. First, how much ATP is stored in your body, in your cells more specifically? I alluded to this earlier. I said that ATP is not stored, so very, very, very little is stored in any cell in your body. ATP is not meant to be stored. Like I described earlier, ATP is a temporary, intermediate fuel molecule. It is what holds the energy, again, in those phosphate bonds for a very temporary period of time after that energy is released from the metabolism of a fuel molecule. In fact, in your muscle cells, there are only enough ATP existing at any given time to provide energy for only 3 seconds of muscle contractions. Now, one of the reasons why ATP exists only for a brief period before it is hydrolyzed is because those phosphate bonds are very weak and unstable, meaning the energy can't be contained in those bonds for too long. This is why ATP can only hold this energy for a very brief period of time. This also means that the production of ATP through bioenergetic systems is on a per demand basis. Again, going back a couple slides, only when the rate of ATP demand increases does the rate of ATP production increase. So production equals demand. You do not produce a bunch of ATP when it's not needed and subsequently store it in the cell like a muscle cell. It's just an intermediate temporary energy source for the muscle cell and all cells in the body for that matter. So if I ask a question such as, even when the rate of ATP demand does not change, your cells can increase the rate of ATP production for later use. This would be a false statement. Again, production is on a demand basis. Okay, question number 2, which I've pretty much addressed. If there is so little ATP in our cells at any given time, how do we live? How do we exercise? The answer is simple. Again, we simply resynthesize ATP at a rate consistent with the cell's demand for ATP. So in a muscle cell, when the muscle cell contracts, it requires more energy and thus more ATP. And thus, the muscle cell will produce more ATP at the rate it needs it. So question number 3, how do our cells then generate ATP? How do our cells resynthesize ATP, more specifically our muscle cells? We discussed that ATP is formed when energy is released and transferred from a fuel molecule to form a new phosphate bond on ADP to form ATP. So in order to release this energy from the fuel molecule must first be broken down, meaning chemical bonds that hold the fuel molecule together must be broken down since the energy is quote unquote trapped in these chemical bonds. This breakdown of a fuel molecule like carbohydrate or fat molecules is referred to as catabolism. Catabolism is simply the process of degrading or breaking down a molecule, like a carbohydrate or a fat molecule. Now, catabolism is caused by reactions collectively called oxidation, which we will discuss later in more detail. But for now, just know that oxidation is usually described as quote unquote burning fuel. It describes the reaction in catabolizing the fuel molecule and releasing the energy from said fuel molecule to form ATP. That is oxidation in a nutshell. Now, also, as shown here, fuel is a very generic term. And I like to use it because it gives students a good general idea of what it is. It's a source of energy. But as I said earlier, these fuel molecules are called nutrients. Nutrients are what provides the body with energy. It's fuel. A more technical term to describe fuel molecules is energy substrate. Now, either one of these terms can be used interchangeably, but in this lecture, I will just continue to utilize the term fuel since it's the most easiest to comprehend. Now, as we said, the breakdown or catabolism and oxidation or burning of fuel to release energy to form ATP is referred to as bioenergetics, and thus ATP is produced through bioenergetic systems or pathways that are either aerobic or anaerobic, with oxygen or without, respectively. So ATP can be produced aerobically with oxygen and anaerobically without oxygen. Now let's clarify how aerobic and anaerobic ATP production function during exercise and clear up some common misnomers and misperceptions on aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. It is clear that in the general population and in the general fitness and sport communities, there is not a clear understanding of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. We often hear terms like aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise, and I'm going to discuss why these are misnomers, and describing exercise as either aerobic or anaerobic actually makes no sense. Now here we have very important fundamental information. Now this information is going to clear up many common misperceptions concerning aerobic and anaerobic metabolism. So let's talk about this common misperception. The common misperception regarding aerobic and anaerobic metabolism is represented here on this figure to the right. Now on the y-axis, you will see represents the rate of ATP production. So how fast ATP is being generated by bioenergetic systems collectively inside your muscle cells. Now on the x-axis, you have general terms to describe how hard your muscles are working. So light effort to max effort, or light intensity to maximum intensity. So without looking at the colored sections here below the curve, just focus for now on this curve. As you can clearly see, as effort increases from light to max, so like from walking to sprinting, for example, the rate of ATP production increases since, of course, as we go from light to max effort, the energy and thus ATP demand increases. Remember, ATP production increases when ATP demand increases. So far, this is basic information. Yes, as we exercise harder, the energy and thus ATP demand increases, and thus our bioenergetic systems will increase the rate of ATP production. Easy information. Now, like I said, our bioenergetic systems are either aerobic or anaerobic. Aerobic requires oxygen to produce ATP, and anaerobic does not require oxygen to produce ATP. Okay, so as I said, this figure represents a common misperception on how aerobic and anaerobic systems work during exercise. Now, many people have the understanding that during light efforts, our muscles rely on aerobic ATP production to meet the rate of ATP demand. And as we increase our effort or intensity, aerobic ATP production, as represented by this white area under the curve, ramps up. And this is why we consume more and more oxygen through our cardiorespiratory system as we increase our intensity. Our heart works harder to get that oxygen to our active muscles to support the aerobic system. Now, this understanding of the aerobic system is correct to some extent. Now, here's where things get misunderstood. Many people believe that at some certain point, at some certain higher level of intensity of exercise or effort, our aerobic systems completely shuts down, and it no longer supplies the ATP and thus energy that is needed by our muscle cells. And the misperception is that what takes over from this point on is anaerobic ATP production, represented by the red area under the curve. And continuing with this misperception, people think that at this point, anaerobic ATP production fully takes over and fully satisfies the ATP demand of the muscle cells. So at this point, all the way to max effort. This is a dichotomous view of aerobic and anaerobic, meaning this is a either or type of perception. To be straightforward, this perception of aerobic and anaerobic metabolism is completely false. There's not one single level of effort or exercise intensity where the aerobic system just completely stops producing ATP and anaerobic systems completely take over. Now, if this was in fact the case, then think about it. At this point of effort or exercise intensity, where the aerobic system completely shuts down, you would stop consuming oxygen at a high rate, meaning your breathing rate and your heart rate would just go back to resting levels, since by this understanding, your muscles don't require higher oxygen availability, since it is now fully dependent on a non-oxygen requiring bioenergetic system, the anaerobic system. We obviously know this never happens. Imagine running on a treadmill and you are increasing the speed every minute. Imagine as you go higher and higher in speed, at one point, your breathing and your heart rate all of a sudden returns to resting levels and stays that way until you reach maximum sprinting intensity. Again, we clearly know this does not occur. We know for a fact that as we go from light to max effort, our breathing and heart rate rises until it maxes out. Why? Because as we go from light to max effort, our oxygen consumption increases until it maxes out. So why do you think our oxygen consumption keeps rising as we increase our effort or intensity of exercise from light to max intensity? Well, it's because our aerobic systems are always, I repeat, always producing ATP, no matter what level of intensity you are exercising at. Aerobic ATP production is the preferred and prioritized means of producing ATP. It is always active and proportionate to the level of effort and ATP demand. So let's look at how aerobic and anaerobic metabolism really function during exercise by examining this figure on the left. Now, as you can see, as effort increases, and thus the rate of ATP demand increases, the aerobic system increases the rate of ATP production, as you can see by this white area under the curve. Now, as you continue to increase the exercise intensity at some higher level of intensity, there is a point in which the aerobic system cannot fully satisfy the full rate of ATP demand. And that point is referred to as the anaerobic threshold. The anaerobic threshold is simply the level of exercise effort or intensity at which the aerobic system cannot fully satisfy the rate at which the muscle cells need ATP. Now, as intensity increases past this anaerobic threshold, there is a further rise in ATP demand, and the aerobic system tries very, very hard to satisfy this rising ATP demand, but it can't fully meet the demand. So as you can see here, the ATP demand is up here, but the ATP production via aerobic system is right here. So the first question is, why can't the aerobic system meet the full ATP demand starting at this point called the anaerobic threshold? It is primarily due to insufficient oxygen availability, since oxygen availability is required for the aerobic system to produce ATP. It doesn't mean oxygen is not present, it just means the rate of oxygen delivery and availability is insufficient for the aerobic system to fully meet the rate of ATP demand by the muscle cells. At this point, the oxygen demand is getting really, really high, but the oxygen delivery and availability can't meet that elevated oxygen demand, and thus the aerobic system cannot fully meet the ATP demand of the muscle cells. So what fills this gap between the ATP demand of the muscle cells and the ATP produced by the aerobic system? What satisfies the portion of the ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot satisfy? This is represented by the red area under the curve. Well, it would make sense that a non-oxygen requiring system would satisfy the ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot cover, since oxygen availability is the limiting factor for the aerobic system. So as we know, this non-oxygen requiring ATP producing system is called the anaerobic system. And as you can see in this figure, the anaerobic system becomes more active as you exercise past this anaerobic threshold because it needs to satisfy the portion of the ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot satisfy. And as you can also see, as we get further away from this anaerobic threshold intensity towards max effort, such as full out sprinting, there is an increasing portion of the ATP demand that cannot be met by the aerobic system. And so the anaerobic system becomes more and more active as you get closer to maximum effort and further away from the anaerobic threshold. So the correct perspective on anaerobic and aerobic metabolism during exercise is that the anaerobic system is simply a backup to the aerobic system during exercise intensities in which the aerobic system cannot fully satisfy the ATP demand of the active muscle cells. Now, another correct perspective is that there is never a situation in which the aerobic system shuts off and the anaerobic system completely takes over. Again, this is false. During exercise intensities at the anaerobic threshold and above, the aerobic system works as hard as it possibly can with the oxygen that is delivered and available to those muscles to meet most of the ATP demand, as you can see right here. But in addition to the aerobic system, the anaerobic system covers the portion of ATP demand that the aerobic system cannot satisfy. So as you can see clearly, the aerobic system is always active no matter what intensity of exercise you are performing. And the anaerobic system only backs up the aerobic system at exercise intensities past the anaerobic threshold. Now, as a side note, we know that generally as intensity increases, we begin to experience fatigue, meaning something is inhibiting our muscles from contracting at full potential. For example, when we do max effort exercise like sprinting, we know we can't sprint at peak speed forever. We get tired, we get fatigue, and we slow down. Our muscles are being inhibited by something. Well, this fatigue occurs when you have reached this anaerobic threshold. So the further you go away from this anaerobic threshold, the more chances of fatigue. Fatigue becomes more severe. So obviously, when you are sprinting all out, you are well above this anaerobic threshold. Now, we will discuss this type of fatigue in more detail later, but why do we experience fatigue when we exercise past this anaerobic threshold? Is it because of anaerobic metabolism? No, not really. Fundamentally, it is because exercise intensities past the anaerobic threshold is a stress to the muscle cells. Now, what is this stress? The stress is hypoxia. Now, some of us believe hypoxia is no oxygen available. That is not entirely accurate. Hypoxia is a state in which the oxygen that is available in the cell does not meet the oxygen that is needed by the cell. So why is exercise past this anaerobic threshold considered a hypoxic condition? Well, let's think critically. Remember, the reason why the aerobic system at this point of the anaerobic threshold cannot fully satisfy the ATP demand is because the oxygen availability does not meet the oxygen demand. Remember, at this point right here, the oxygen demand has increased pretty high. But the reason why the aerobic system cannot fully satisfy the ATP demand is because the oxygen availability does not meet the demand. If the oxygen demand at this point was met, then the aerobic system can fully satisfy the ATP demand. So this means as you increase intensity further past this anaerobic threshold, the muscle cells are further in a hypoxic state, which becomes increasingly stressful for the muscle cells. So the stress of hypoxia starts here at the anaerobic threshold. And as you increase the intensity towards max effort, it becomes more and more stressful because the hypoxia gets even greater and greater. Now, as we know, hypoxia for any cell is no good. It can cause cellular death. This is why when we hold our breath, our body does everything it can to force you to breathe. So one way the muscle deals with this stress is by inhibiting muscle contractions, thereby decreasing ATP and thus oxygen demand of those muscle cells. This thereby reduces your intensity, bringing you back below the anaerobic threshold and getting your muscle cells out of this hypoxic state. Altogether, this is simply described as fatigue. So this should get your brains going a bit, thinking about fatigue, because I can assure you many people do not fully understand why we fatigue when we do high to max level exercise. Many people think fatigue is we run out of fuel. No, when we sprint and get fatigued from that one sprint, it is absolutely not because our muscle cells are depleted of fuel. We slow down during the sprint because of a stress response, a response to the hypoxic environment. Okay, as I said, this is a major topic in my exercise bioenergetics class, so stay tuned till then. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a preview. I talk a lot about the science of muscular fatigue because if you really think about it, muscular fatigue is the main factor that is detrimental to performance. So whether you're playing sports, whether you're at the gym exercising, fatigue is the major factor that limits performance. Okay, so moving onward. With all that being said about aerobic and anaerobic metabolism and how they work together during exercise, when someone describes some higher level of intensity of exercise as quote-unquote anaerobic, this would be completely false and nonsensical. If I asked one of you to describe anaerobic exercise, you would say something to the effect of high to max intensity exercise like sprinting. Now you understand that describing this type of exercise as anaerobic is a misnomer, since you can see this type of exercise like sprinting is highly and mostly aerobic. Your aerobic systems are working very, very hard to meet the high rate or the max rate of ATP demand. It's just that the portion of energy that is needed by the cell cannot be fully satisfied aerobically. So the anaerobic systems just simply back it up and fulfill this energy / ATP need by the muscle cell. So this is why I stay away from terms like anaerobic or aerobic exercise or anaerobic or aerobic fitness, because they do not make any sense from a scientific standpoint. How can you do exercise that is only anaerobic? There is no way, since aerobic systems are always active and increases proportionate to the intensity of exercise. So no matter if you're doing max effort exercise like sprinting, the aerobic systems are very, very active. So how does one say anaerobic fitness? How can you be anaerobically fit? There is no way to ever isolate anaerobic metabolism or just simply train anaerobic systems. Now, there's a lot of faulty programs out there that are claimed to enhance anaerobic systems and anaerobic fitness. It just does not make any sense from a scientific standpoint. It is not consistent with scientific fact. So I challenge you not to buy into those types of things that you see out there in the media. I challenge you to go and Google anaerobic fitness, and I guarantee you that you will find tons of blog posts and articles written by so-called fitness experts, and I guarantee the information in that article is completely false and not consistent with scientific facts. So a lesson here is, do not believe everything you read on the internet, especially when it comes to aerobic and anaerobic fitness or exercise, just because it was written by someone touted as a fitness expert. You need to be smarter than that. And as you grow in knowledge, like during this course, you will gather the confidence to rebuttal against those who spew misinformation. So instead of using terms like aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise to describe exercise, I rather use the terms pre-anaerobic threshold exercise to describe exercise in which the ATP demand is fully satisfied by the aerobic system because there is sufficient oxygen availability to meet the oxygen demand to support aerobic ATP production. It does not require any anaerobic backup system to help satisfy some portion of the ATP demand that it cannot cover. And post-anaerobic threshold exercise is simply exercise in which the aerobic system cannot fully satisfy the full ATP demand of the muscle cells because of limited oxygen availability. And so anaerobic systems simply back up the aerobic system during post-anaerobic threshold exercise. So pre-anaerobic threshold versus post-anaerobic threshold. So sprinting should be described not as anaerobic exercise, it should be described as post-anaerobic threshold exercise. You just going for a light jog or walking, it shouldn't be called aerobic exercise. It should be simply called pre-anaerobic threshold exercise. Now, if you want a simple resource for myth busting in fitness and exercise and information on the latest research in exercise science, feel free to check out my social media page on Instagram at dr.eddiejoe. I have tons of free infographics with many articles attached to it to educate the fitness and exercising community. Now, one of the infographics and articles that I posted on my Instagram page is on the information I provided just now on aerobic and anaerobic systems. So feel free to check it out. Okay, so just to summarize everything we talked about here, we have to understand that the anaerobic system is simply a backup to the aerobic system during situations in which the aerobic system, due to limited oxygen availability, cannot fully satisfy the ATP demand of the muscle cells. So a non-oxygen requiring system, the anaerobic system, covers the portion of the ATP demand that the aerobic systems cannot fulfill so that the muscle cells gets the ATP that it needs. And remember the terminology, anaerobic threshold. This is the point at which the aerobic system cannot fully satisfy the ATP demand and the anaerobic systems need to back it up. Now, one of the terms on here that we didn't discuss is aerobic capacity. Aerobic capacity just simply means the maximum rate of ATP production by the aerobic system. So this is obviously going to be at max effort, max intensity exercise. So one of the labs that you will do is to measure your aerobic capacity. And the variable that represents aerobic capacity is called your VO2 max, your maximum oxygen consumption. That is going to reflect the max rate of ATP production by your aerobic system. Okay, so as we move on from here, now that you understand generally how aerobic and anaerobic systems function during exercise and how they simply work together to fully satisfy the ATP needs of the muscle cells, especially during exercise past the anaerobic threshold, we can go into much more details regarding the anaerobic systems and the aerobic systems.